What's up, everyone? I haven't been on in a while. We're going to talk about 5 tips to improve your mixes. These are tips that will really go across any genre of music. By the way, welcome to all the new subscribers since the last video that I did live, which was about a week ago, a week and a half, something like that. There's thousands more people, and welcome to any of you who are new to the channel. If you're new to the channel, you'll know I always do a discount on my live streams that goes for 24 hours for my Beato book, which only comes in PDF form, although I printed out a copy and had it bound. And the code is RB150. Aaron is moderating the channel and or the live stream, and he'll be periodically posting it in there. I see all of you in there. Even though it's going by fast, I can read fast. Okay, so let's get to this, okay? This is these are things that I talk about a lot when I was producing. I would talk to people that were in bands that I worked with, because these were things that I haven't produced in about 2 years or so, but these would be common things that people would come in and ask, because there's always somebody from every band I worked with that was the guy that did the recordings. They would typically do the demos for the band, and they're the guys that eventually go on to be future producers, okay? And it doesn't really matter what genre, because the things I'm going to talk about go cross-genre. And they really can be applied to, to rock, to hip-hop, to jazz, everything, okay? So let me talk about a few principles here that I think are really important. One of them is to understand the registers of where things are, for example, sibilant, okay? Or where things are boomy, where things are muddy, where things are honky. You hear these words, but you don't know what those words mean, or actually some of you probably do know what they mean. And these are things that in your mix will, on the level where it's maybe not that bad, they'll improve your mix and make it 10% better. But they're also things that will kill your mix, that will actually really make people not want to listen to your music, okay? And I think that the most important thing that you can do is to reduce sibilance. Now, sibilance can be anything from S-ing, me saying the word S. Those S's can rip your head off in a mix with a vocalist, okay? But sibilance doesn't just have to be on vocals. You can have sibilance on cymbals, okay? And I've heard this a lot of times where I'll get in a recording and the cymbals will be really, really hissy sounding. And that kills your ear. It also impedes your ability to turn your mixes up loud. When vocals have a lot of sibilance, it's very distracting, which is why they use de-essing. Now, back when I was started on tape, we would use de-essers to track with. Now you don't have to do that because they have plug-in de-essers, and there's a lot of good plug-in de-essers. There's many different ones that you can use everywhere. Everything from, Waves has the Renaissance. Waves has just the regular de-esser, which is very good. But, Massey plugins are great. That I'm trying to think of some other de-essers that are and then you can get into the Oxford, the suppressor. You can get into these really, really sophisticated de-essers, or use, or you can turn an EQ and a compressor into a de-esser. I mean, I used to use things before they had the dedicated compressors. The very first plugins in Pro Tools, McDSP had a frequency-dependent compressor in their compressor bank, for example. So de-essing is really important, but also reducing sibilance in the 3 to 5K range or 3 to 4K range is incredibly important, okay? These are the areas that if there isn't enough of this, your mix will not have presence, but if there's too much, it'll kill your ears, okay? Human beings can really hear 3K very well, 3 to 4K. We can hear them. It's in everything we listen to, pretty much, is that range. The articulation of speech is really in that range, which is why you'll see people that get in their 50s and 60s are always saying, huh, huh, your parents. What is he saying? And the reason, I've got a lot of friends that are like that, and the reason is that they get this 4K notch in their hearing that can be a lot of times down to minus 18 dB, like an incredible reduction of the ability to hear those frequencies. So what do you typically do when you can't hear those frequencies? Well, a lot of people will turn them up. Okay, so what do you do if your hearing is impaired in that range? Well, there's a couple things you can do. You can use a frequency analyzer. And I will see professional recording engineers that will, I was talking with somebody about this recently, an incredibly good engineer that's done a lot of big records. This a few years ago. I went to the studio. I won't say where it was, but it's a guy that I had worked with before, and I was doing a couple songs with this band that he had just finished. So as soon as I walk in, I said to the head engineer, I said, so what's up with the frequency analyzer? And he goes, oh, I said, does he use that a lot? And he says, yeah, that's the first thing he puts up. Well, why does he put that up? Because he is in his 50s, late 50s, and he wants to make sure that he's not missing anything. And that is an aid in which to do that. Now, they have frequency analyzers that are plugins now. They have plenty of different ones. Andre just said humans perceive 4K better. That's why, but that's also why it can why it is fatiguing to the ear as well. It can hear that, so it can become fatiguing to the ear, which is why you have to really be careful. A lot of times your mix, you cannot turn it up loud if you have too much 3 to 4K in it. Those upper mids are just absolute killers, okay? So you have to be very, very careful of that. Same thing is with the 1K range. Now the 1K range, well, actually, let me talk about a couple other frequency ranges. If I want to bring out a piano, for example, in a mix, okay, I'm going to start going in the 2.5K range or so, where I'm going to get that, the mids to where I can hear it. If it's a dense mix and I want to hear it there, I'm going to do that. I'm going to reach for something in that area, okay? As you move down into the 1K area, this is where you get your honkiness from. 1K is really has a very nasally sound to it, okay? If you have a lot of 1K, hey Peter, if you have a lot of 1K in your guitar, for example, it will sound very honky. And it's typically with distorted guitars. And on clean guitars, if you have 1K, a lot of times that will actually help you have presence in your single note definition if you're a jazz musician. So not having enough 1K in your sound can make your sound hollow. But having too much will make it sound nasally. So that's a problem area that you have to look for. Now, as you get into your lower frequencies, let's say 350 to 600 or even 350 to 800, this is where your boxiness comes in. Your boxiness these are areas where there's a lot of information from a lot of instruments, okay? Hey, Peter. So, for example, when you're going to EQ a kick drum, now typically, this is not necessarily if you're going for a John Bonham drum, but a typical rock kick drum, or even a kick drum that would be a hip-hop sounding kick drum, you're going to reduce that range there because that takes up a lot of area in the mix, especially as you get into a dense mix. That mid-range, and this started to be the style in the 70s where people would start dipping out the mids in the kick drum, usually between 350 and 350 to 500 or so. And then later on in mixdown, you would dip out even more, and you would see these curves like this. Well, they started then putting those curves into microphones. If you look at an AKG D112 that looks like an egg, that microphone has a frequency curve that is really built around that, removing all those mid frequencies from the kick drum, because those things just make your mix sound muddy. Okay, you want to hear the attack of the kick drum, you want to hear the air of the kick drum. Those are in two different places. Typically, the attack of your kick drum can be anywhere from 2K up to 8K. Okay, if you're listening to a Metallica kick drum, you're going to have a lot of 6K attack where it's really spiky sounding, which is what I call it. But if you listen to somebody like Andy Wallace, his mixes, for example, will have a lot of more 2K, where it doesn't rip your head off and doesn't sound like a typewriter. Okay, so this is a thing that guys that do a lot of metal, you'll have a lot of attack and a very processed kick sound. But as you put this into the mix, especially if there's a lot of double kicks going on, it can get really clicky and annoying to the ear. So you have to really be careful with that. Now, on the low end of the kick drum, typically you have to decide what is going to have the low end emphasis in your mix. Is it going to be a bass heavy mix, or is it going to be a kick heavy mix? And that's where you're going to decide what instrument's going to occupy those instruments. They can't both occupy the same frequency range. Don't go in and boost 60 hertz on your kick drum and boost 60 hertz on your bass, okay? If you're going to boost 60 hertz on your kick, you're going to cut 60 hertz on your bass. You might boost 100 hertz on your bass, okay? But these are things that you figure out beforehand, okay? These are like when you're tracking, these are things to be looking for, so that when you get to the mix stage, you're not trying to fix all this stuff. So you want to get your sounds as close as possible to what they're going to be, and make sure that every instrument is occupying its own frequency range, okay? Guitars don't need, if they're in with a bass and you want your bass to sound big, they don't need a lot below 100 hertz. Acoustic guitars, electric guitars, sometimes with distorted electric guitars, you'll shelve it up to 200 hertz, okay? Because you only want that mid-range information. Another thing you might do with distorted electric guitars, so they don't sound like buzzsaws, is you may low pass it, meaning you may take some of the high end off it. Although I don't like to do that. I don't like to necessarily limit the ranges on the top end. I will usually use a shelf and dip it down, so that I don't have a lot of what I call hair on the guitars. That's a really annoying buzziness. I like buzziness if it's a square wave buzziness, okay? Something that's from, guitars. I'm trying to think who's really good at doing those square wave guitars. Well, I mean, honestly, a lot of these bands like Periphery or Chevelle or bands like that, they have a lot of square wave information in their guitars, okay? And I like to call those buzzsaw guitars. I like those. They're very aggressive. They have very aggressive square wavy sound that really cuts through. This is the other thing. Distortion helps instruments cut through. I talk about this a lot on live streams. If you want to hear something, you can add distortion to it and you will be able to hear it. If you can't hear your bass in the mix, bleed in some distortion. Put a Sans amp or put a decapitator on a send, or put some type of a run your bass out and through some type of a distortion pedal and bring the signal back in and make sure it's in phase into Pro Tools or Logic and bleed that in. Okay, that distortion is going to help give instruments clarity. It doesn't matter what it is. You can put distortion on a snare drum. I do it all the time, or I used to do it all the time. Okay, distortion can really go on anything and it will give it presence. Okay, That's why people like things like tape compression, because it's not just the tape compression, it's the added harmonics. If you look at a snare drum that's gone through onto tape, and you bring it into Pro Tools, and you A/B it versus the direct into Pro Tools waveform, and you just look at it, the waveform is way more complex, the waveform that has gone to tape, okay? So it'll be much more jagged looking. It has way more information. It will also look like it's compressed because it will have more length to it. That's what tape compression does. That's what compression does. It can, it can add length to things. Compression doesn't always add length, okay? Saturation, I keep seeing saturation in here. Saturation, distortion, they're just the same. You're adding harmonic information here, okay? But I saw this. Does the square waveform come from the compressor? You can have your waveforms if it hits a compressor, if it gets limited, okay, and you print it that way, you'll see that your snare drum, for example, or anything with a transient can be squared off at the top because it's hitting a compressor and it's limiting that, okay? Now, that can be used to great effect. But it also can be limiting the dynamic range like that can also really affect your transients and your punchiness. Okay, so you have to be really careful with this kind of stuff. This is why compression is another thing that you need to understand. Okay, compression is not just used for dynamic control. It can be used for tone shaping. Okay, there's many types of compression. In the digital realm now, we have things like multi-band compressors that are very common. They didn't, when Pro Tools, Logic, things like that started, Cubase started 15 years ago, you didn't have all the choices that you have now. But now there are so many different types of multi-band compressors and limiters. For example, McDSP makes the MC2000 multi-band limiter, or multi-band compressor. They also make the ML4000, I believe it is, a multi-band limiter, okay? These things can be used for tone shaping, these compressors, and they're used basically like a de-esser would be. You can go in and radically change the sound of an instrument, no matter what instrument it is, by using a multi-band compressor. And it acts differently than an EQ does, okay? So that's another thing that is really great to experiment with is multi-band compression because it can act like an EQ. Compressors, that's when I say that they're tone shaping. Well, they're also, in addition to limiting the frequency range, they can be used to create excitement through pumping, okay? Now, there's good pumping and there's bad pumping. And sometimes, when your mixes where the cymbals sound all washed out, where there's too much compression either on the drum submix or there's too much compression on the master bus limiter or compressor, you'll start getting into this really hashy sounding, noisy cymbals that basically bleed over the whole mix and actually weaken it and make it hard to listen to. Cymbals that are compressed too much, you really need to be careful with cymbals. You can compress room mics, and you can compress overheads, but you want to make sure that you're not compressing them too much, because what you don't want is you don't want that wash of the cymbals to start interfering with the guitars, for example, or the vocals, anything in the mid-range where you have where you want to have presence. I think that's, these are areas to be really, really careful with. Okay, so be careful not to make your cymbals. So I think that's the biggest mistake that I hear in mixes is compression, too much compression on drums, too much compression on cymbals. It can be either from the overheads or from the room mics. Now, done just right, compression is amazing, but you need to get your compression attack and release correct. Okay. For example, if I'm using a compressor on a bass and I'm doing a tune that's at a slow tempo and I'm playing with an electric bass or with a keyboard bass that has an attack but then the sound will die off. what I will do is I will try to time the release of the compressor to hold the note the length of time that you need to hold it until the next main beat occurs. It's the same thing, for example, with reverbs. They work in the same way. If you have a snare reverb, you want it to last to till the next important beat. It may be that the snare hits on 2 and the reverb lasts until 3, till beat 3, and cuts right off with a kick drum that if there's a kick on 3. These are important things. The cutoffs of these. Everybody always thinks of the attacks, but they don't think of the back end. This actually goes for improvising too. You bend a note, you give it a vibrato, but what you do at the end of the note is just as important as what you do at the beginning of the note. Okay, so always be thinking of these things. Is my reverb cutting off in the right spot? Is my snare drum, if you're using a live drummer, are my wires, my snare wires, lasting for a long enough period? For example, on slow tempo songs, you want your snare wires, it's typical to have them last longer, meaning that they rattle longer to take up more time. Fast tempo songs, you don't want them. You want your snares tighter so they don't last as long and bleed onto the other beats, okay? So all of this stuff is really important. The same thing goes in using reverbs on things that have any high frequency information. Vocals, drums. If you use reverb on those, if you use reverb on drums, let's say you use a reverb on your snare. If you have a lot of hi-hat bleed or cymbal wash in the snare drum mic, what you don't want to be doing is you don't want to be putting it through a reverb that's going to accentuate that sound every time, okay? Which is why you would either copy the track, put a very tight gate on it so it sounds natural still, and send that to the reverb, or you could take a sample, put in a sample on its own track. You could actually send the sample, pre-fader sample to the reverb where it's not even being used in the track. So you have the real snare being played, but the gate is triggering the reverb, okay? The sample's triggering the reverb without being heard, okay? Somebody put up, Michael just put on here, how do you prevent bleed? Okay. A lot of bleed is caused by bad playing. It's the same thing as when I gave my 5 tips for guitar or for bass. Muting of the right and left hand is incredibly important, probably the most important thing with playing cleanly in whatever you're doing, okay? Well, with drums, it's the same thing, but you have to learn how to not bash your cymbals. Like chaining on the hi-hat is what I call it. Where you're playing the hi-hat, 30% louder than you're hitting the snare. You want to reverse those. If you listen to old recordings of guys like John Bonham or Keith Moon or whoever, great drummers would always balance themselves in the room. And I always tell bands, listen, if you can't balance yourself, I tell drummers, if you can't balance yourself in the room, you can't get a good drum sound. There's that funny story about Glyn Johns I told on here, I think. I don't know, or maybe I told it on the other channel, but where Don Henley came to him and said, I think the kick drum needs to be a little bit louder. And so Glyn Johns said, well, you need to hit it louder. Hit it harder. He's listening to the room mics. He comes back on playback. And good drummers will come into the control room and listen to playback. I've worked with guys, I've worked with drummers like Josh Freese or Vinny Colaiuta or whoever, these pro drummers like that, right? They will typically go out, you get your drum sound, they'll do it pass, and they'll come in and listen. And what they listen for is they listen to see how their drums are mixed. If one of them's playing, as Andre just said, lead cymbal, okay? That is if you're hitting your cymbals too hard, what you want to do is you want to hit your drums hard and your cymbals not as hard. And you want to have those drums, you want to have that balance just right so you can actually compress the drums nicely so you get the punch out of them, but you don't get the excessive wash. Now, What are other ways to keep wash out of drums? Well, for example, your hi-hat pointing away from or the mic on the snare pointing away from the hi-hat. You ever notice on the hi-hat that your mic will be pointing away from the snare like that? Okay, the reason they do that is to get as much rejection of the snare in the hi-hat mic. It's the same problem, right? Now, you also have to know about getting things in phase. There are so many different things on this. See, I see this guy I says in the comics section, he says, I'm going to get killed using Superior Drummer. Okay, so I use Superior Drummer all the time, or I used to. I do it for demos. The toms in Superior Drummers on a lot of the drum kits, the toms last way too long. It's not like you can just pull up those drum things, those drum sounds, and just use them like they are. The drum sounds, even on those, what they don't do, they have a long decay on them on purpose, so that you can actually use them on all different tempo songs. But if you're doing an up-tempo song and you have a long decay on your floor tom, it's going to muddy up your whole mix, especially if it's hanging over the next important beat. You know, if the drummer's hitting the floor tom on 4 and it's lasting till 2 of the next bar, it's going to be smearing the downbeat of the transients on the kick on beat 1. Okay, so you're going to want to put gates, even in Superior drums. You have to control the sound of the toms, for example, okay? Now, some of the sounds are really well recorded. Some of the libraries in Superior drums, like the Avatar drums, I think, are very, very well recorded. That was, who did it? Nigel, I forget who did those, but it's got about 7 different snare possibilities. It's got a lot of different possibilities. And you'll start, the thing about using Superior drums, and a lot of people will use these things for their actual recording. And when I hear them, I'm like, oh man, he's using drum kit from hell, or he's using just the stock pop drum kit, or he's using that, or she's using this, whatever, right? It's like you recognize these things. Everybody that uses these things recognizes all the stock sounds on there. So you don't want to just put up the presets. You want to try and sculpt. If you're using a drum program like that, you want to try and sculpt using the available samples that are there. Tune them to the track, okay? Don't be afraid to use the pitch control in there and make them make them fit your track just right so that they're not easily recognizable, okay? Another incredibly important tip: high pass almost everything, okay? Everything that you can. What you do is, because really there's 2 instruments that are going to occupy the low end, okay? It's going to be your kick and bass, or in your orchestra, it's going to be your bass, your basses, or your tubas, or your, or your bassoon, or your contrabassoon. Okay, these are things that are going to occupy the low frequency spectrum. And anything above that, with acoustic instruments, they're actually been, if they're recorded properly in sample libraries, if you're using Spitfire or something like that, and they're recorded really well, then you don't have to worry as much about these things. But if you're using things from the same sample libraries, okay, and they're done in the same room, you're going to get a lot of the same resonances, okay? So it's going to still sound, you may not have the clarity that you really want. So you may want to go in and EQ the sounds. You may want to do something, you may want to use, cinematic strings blended in with your strings, or some of the cinematic strings blended in with your Spitfire audio to give them a different tone, so that you may only use it on the violas or something like that. So to give them a different tone so that they will actually have their occupy their own space. And that's really what this high passing is. It's about getting things to occupy your own space. A lot of times, for example, if you're recording metal and you have a drummer, you'll high pass the drums many times, all the way up to 500 hertz. You'll take all the low end out of it. And one of the reasons that you do this is that you don't have the same phasing issues. If you take the kick drum out of the equation and you take a lot of the bottom end of the snare drum out of the equation in the overheads, and you use them as cymbal mics, you don't have to worry as much about these, and you can have more control. Okay, and this is one of the reasons that you want to use rides as much as possible. Okay, one of the best tips that I ever got is riding the overheads on cymbal crashes, for example, so that they have the right kind of decay. So I will typically go in and I will, if it's a tempo, and I will go up with a fader and then back with it. And when you come back, you're able to control the punchiness. You get the decay of the punchiness of the drums, the transients, without having all that cymbal wash, yet you have really nice decay on your cymbals, okay? Without having to compress them a lot. That being said, don't be afraid to use compression on your mix bus. Everyone uses compression on their mix bus. They just do, okay? All big mixers. I'm going to be interviewing Chris Lord-Elgee next week. I'm going to talk to him about that when I go to NAMM. We're going to talk a lot about compression, I would imagine. And most pro mixers will put a compressor on right at the beginning of their mix, and they will mix through the compressor. Now, this compressor is either an analog compressor that's coming off a console, or it's on your mix bus, your 2 bus, okay? Now, many times you will not only have a compressor on there, but you'll also have an EQ. And a lot of people will EQ the entire mix. It's very common. You ask Joe Barresi, ask Andy Wallace, ask anybody. I mean, so many people will EQ their master bus. Serban, people that do pop music, whatever. I mean, it's very common to have EQ on your mix bus. As far as how much compression to use on your mix bus, it's so I've had mixes, or I've seen mixes where people have used 8 dB of compression on the mix bus for heavy rock music, using the auto release on an SSL or on an Allen Smart C2 compressor, and it sounds incredible. Okay, and then I see people that will use very little compression, and they'll just want to control the transients. I have a video on compression. If you guys want to really get into it more, I have a video on EQ and compression that you should definitely check out on this channel. But those are more, well, I talk about mixed bus compression in that, and I demonstrate a bunch of different compressors. Although that video is a couple years old, and I want to go back and do another one using more, some of the more contemporary plugins that are out now, along with which I will do with Pro Tools 12, for example. So the attack and release of the compression on the mix bus is incredibly important. Okay, the slower the release, the more transients get through before the compressor grabs it. Okay, so if you're feeling like your drums aren't punchy enough, make the attack time longer so it doesn't engage as quickly. If you want to get more attack out of them, if you want it to grab those transients, you do it the other way. Same thing. A lot of people, if they're using an SSL compressor, or if you're using a Focusrite Red 3, even the plug-in versions, many people will go in and just put on auto release. Okay, that's like program dependent. But you can shape your mix and the pumping of your mix by using the release, okay? Once again, this is dependent on the tempo of the track. So you can't make generalizations on it necessarily, right? Because you really can't say, what's up, Levi? You can't really say what the, I can't say, because I'm not listening to your mix. If, you may have a very mix with very few elements in it that actually can have a tremendous amount of bottom end in it, okay? Because there's nothing competing in the low register. If you're doing some hip hop music or something where there's just not a lot of mid-range information, or you could be doing, some progressive metal, and there's just every last bit of it is eaten up, every frequency range. You've got distorted guitars in stereo. You got guitars up the center. You got a big bass. It's got distortion on it. And you got drums. You got a lot of compression on it. And then you're trying to get the vocal to stand out. Okay, so there are so many different elements of this to understand. And I would suggest going back in and watching some of these older videos that I did on this. I mean, I've done videos on recording on tape. I've done videos on tape compression where I show the difference between what a snare sounds like direct into Pro Tools or coming off the tape machine and put into Pro Tools. I got them all on here. There's 600 videos. A lot of people, I think, most people watch the current videos and they'll just look down the thing and they'll just, but there's so much information on my channel that I've already put out there that, like the EQ, how the pros use EQ, how the pros use compression, those are very, 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 very important. I see Renzo put, guitars cutting through equals more mids. Yeah, depending. Certain people will add 3K in their guitars to make them jump out. Other people will take it away. Guys like Eric Valentin, who's a great engineer. He doesn't like a lot of that upper mid distortion. He likes to be able to crank your guitars up really loud. I mean, you think about some of the records that he did. He engineered the Queens of the Stone Age, Songs for the Deaf. He did Third Eye Blind. He did a lot of great sounding records. And his guitars have a very unique sound. Whereas Chris Lord-Alge, his guitars are right in this. They occupy just the right amount of mid range. Andy Wallace has more 3K in his guitars. Julian just asked what I think about parallel compression. I use parallel compression all the time. Parallel compression in the old days with plugins, it's easy because everything has a mix knob on it, so it's not as much. Hey Dan, what's up? It's not as much using Mixbus or using parallel compression. Used to be a thing that people talked about a lot more, but pretty much every plugin now has a mix knob on it, and use the mix knob on it, okay? Because that's really important with parallel compression, because you can put a lot of compression on an instrument, back that off, and find the sweet spot where you're actually blending in the uncompressed sound with the heavily compressed sound. Now, a lot of times people would, you call it the New York sound or the LA sound. They would actually go to a track that had compression and EQ on it, and they would use that, their parallel compression track like that, which you can still do, but I think that most people now with that are using plugins, and I think most of you do. I bet 95% of you use plugins. You're not using outboard gear, so and not mixing through a console. Anyway, so these are just a few tips here to improve your mixes. Mixing is an art. That's why they have people that get paid a lot of money to do mixes. That's why if you know a good mixer and you're not good at it, hire somebody to do it for you, okay? It's really crucial. A great mixer can make a massively big difference, okay? Buy the Beato book. Everything's 20% off in my store today. RB150 is the, that's how I make a living for my family, is through that. And for, and you can, I've got coffee mugs that have all the, the harmonic major scale, the melodic minor scales, the formulas for all the scales, all the triads, everything. You guys are the best. Thank you so much. Check out my newest video on odd times with Polini. I feature a Polini track on there. He's a great guitar player, a very cool band. And you should check it out. Tune's called Electric Sunrise. Subscribe if you haven't. You guys are awesome. Thank you.